Wanda Kessler stood in the doorway of a Rockford, Illinois hospital room in February of 1956, listening to a doctor explain in careful, measured words that her husband Gerald hadn't survived the fall he'd taken at the canning plant that morning. She had 4 children waiting at home, the youngest not yet 2 years old, and a purse holding exactly $10, the last of what remained from Gerald's final pay envelope before whatever came next got sorted out. Nobody warns a new widow that grief arrives at the exact same moment as arithmetic, that somewhere underneath the shock, a mind keeps working out how many meals $10 can actually stretch across when 4 children are depending on every single one of them. What Wanda built from that $10 over the following days is a story worth hearing in full, because the list she wrote that first night still holds lessons most of us have never had to learn ourselves. If stories about quiet resilience matter to you, subscribe now, because Wanda's grocery list is only where this story begins. Wanda and Gerald had been married 9 years by the time of the accident. Long enough that Wanda had grown accustomed to managing the household budget carefully, but never desperately. Gerald's steady wage from the canning plant covering their small rented house on Prospect Street, with enough left over most weeks for something modest and unnecessary, a treat for the children, a new spool of thread, a magazine picked up at the corner drugstore. That comfortable margin disappeared the same afternoon Gerald did, and Wanda understood, sitting in that hospital hallway with 4 children's faces already forming in her mind, that the $10 in her purse wasn't simply money anymore. It was every meal her family would eat until she figured out what came after this. Gerald had worked the loading dock at the canning plant for the better part of 6 years, a job that paid steadily, if never generously, and the accident itself, a fall from an unsecured platform during an ordinary Tuesday shift, was the kind of thing everyone at that plant quietly understood could happen to any of them on any given day, though none of them ever expected it to actually arrive at their own front door. Wanda had kissed Gerald goodbye that morning the same way she had thousands of mornings before it, with nothing about the moment suggesting it might be the last one they'd ever share. She walked home that evening with her sister-in-law, who had come to sit with the children, and the 2 of them talked through what needed to happen in the days immediately ahead: the funeral arrangements, the insurance paperwork Gerald's employer would need to process, the rent that would still come due regardless of what had happened at that canning plant. But underneath all of it sat the more immediate, more physical question neither of them said out loud that first night. What would Ruthie, Mark, Paul, and baby Carol actually eat tomorrow, and the day after, and every day until something more permanent could be sorted out? Wanda sat at her kitchen table late that same night, well after the children had finally fallen asleep, and pulled out a small notepad she normally used for grocery lists, the same one she'd used for years to keep Gerald's modest wage stretched sensibly across a week of meals. This time, though, she wasn't planning around Gerald's paycheck. She was planning around $10 and an unknown number of days before anything else arrived to replace it. The first decision Wanda made that night would shape everything that followed. She wasn't going to buy food the way she normally did, a little of everything that sounded good, some variety across the week to keep 4 children from complaining about the same meal twice. She was going to buy foundations instead, ingredients flexible enough to become several completely different meals depending on how she combined them, rather than a single dish's worth of specific items that would run out the moment that particular meal was finished. Flour topped the list, a full 5-pound sack, because bread, biscuits, and simple dumplings could all come from the exact same bag, stretching considerably further than any single loaf purchased ready-made from a bakery. Dried beans came next, a pound of them, cheap and filling in a way that meat, at the prices Rockford grocers were charging that particular winter, simply couldn't compete with. A dozen eggs, versatile enough to appear at breakfast, folded into whatever bread she baked, or scrambled thin and stretched across 4 plates when nothing else in the pantry seemed like quite enough. A small sack of potatoes, considerably larger in total food value than its modest price suggested, capable of becoming breakfast, a side dish, or, mashed thin with a little milk, nearly a meal on its own for a hungry child who wouldn't necessarily notice how little was actually on the plate in front of them. Wanda has been quoted in a local newspaper feature written decades later when her grandchildren finally convinced her to share the story publicly, as saying that $10 felt considerably larger once she stopped thinking about individual meals and started thinking about ingredients that could multiply across several of them. But knowing what to buy was only half the problem that first week. The other half was making it actually last. Wanda's first grocery trip after the funeral took nearly 2 hours, considerably longer than her usual shopping normally required, because she found herself doing arithmetic in the aisle that she'd never needed to do quite so precisely before, weighing every single item against what it could realistically become, rather than simply what it cost. She skipped the canned goods entirely that first trip, understanding that a can of prepared soup, however convenient, delivered considerably less actual food per dollar than the same money spent on raw ingredients she could stretch. She bought a small piece of salt pork, not enough to serve as an actual meal on its own, but enough to flavor a full pot of beans across several days, transforming plain, filling food into something her children would actually look forward to eating, rather than simply tolerate. By the time she reached the register, Wanda had spent $9.30, leaving 70 cents in reserve for whatever she hadn't thought to anticipate, a small margin she'd learned to build into every decision from watching her own mother manage a household through leaner years decades earlier. That first week tested every part of the plan Wanda had written out at her kitchen table. Sunday's dinner became a pot of beans, simmered slowly with that small piece of salt pork, served alongside biscuits made from the flour she'd bought, a meal that cost pennies per serving, but filled 4 children's stomachs completely. Monday's dinner was the same pot of beans, thickened further with a bit more flour and stretched with whatever remained of Sunday's biscuits, transformed just enough through reheating and small additions that none of her children complained about eating the same thing twice. By Tuesday, what remained of the beans had become the base for a simple soup, thinned with water and enriched with a single egg stirred through at the end, a meal that used almost nothing new from that week's grocery list at all. Ruthie, 11 years old and old enough to understand exactly how carefully her mother was managing every decision that week, began helping without being asked, watching the twins and rocking baby Carol while Wanda worked in the kitchen, a small act of quiet partnership that Wanda has said in the years since she never fully thanked her daughter enough for at the time. Mark and Paul, the twins, had just turned 8 that January, old enough to notice the household felt different, but young enough that hunger, when it crept close to the edge of what Wanda's careful planning could actually prevent, expressed itself simply as complaint rather than any real understanding of why. There was one evening that first week when Paul pushed his plate of beans away, declaring flatly that he was tired of eating the same thing, and Wanda, exhausted in a way that went considerably deeper than the physical work of that day alone, felt something close to panic rise in her chest before she caught herself. She sat down beside him instead of raising her voice, explained as gently and as honestly as an 8-year-old could reasonably absorb that this was what they had for now, and that it would get better, a promise she genuinely wasn't certain she could keep, but made anyway because her son needed to hear it regardless. Paul ate his beans that night, slowly, and Wanda has said she never forgot the particular weight of that small moment for the rest of her life. There was a moment midweek, roughly Wednesday evening, when Wanda genuinely wasn't certain the food would actually stretch through Sunday the way she'd calculated it would. She opened the flour sack and found less remaining than she'd expected, a miscalculation from an earlier batch of biscuits that had used more than she'd accounted for. And she sat at that same kitchen table once the children were asleep, recalculating everything with a considerably tighter margin than she'd started the week believing she had. She made a decision that evening that would become one of the defining habits of that entire difficult stretch. Rather than buying more flour immediately, spending money from her shrinking 70-cent reserve, she adjusted the remaining day's meals instead, replacing Thursday's planned biscuits with plain boiled potatoes, considerably cheaper per serving, and requiring nothing at all from the flour sack she was now determined to make last through Sunday, regardless of what it took. This willingness to adjust the plan itself, rather than simply spending more money the moment a plan proved slightly wrong, became something Wanda relied on again and again throughout those first difficult weeks. A grocery list, she came to understand, wasn't a fixed contract. It was a starting point, flexible enough to bend around whatever reality actually delivered once the week was already underway. She began keeping a small mental list of substitutions, always knowing what could stand in for what if a particular ingredient ran short before the week was finished. A kind of quiet insurance policy that cost her nothing beyond the attention she'd already been paying anyway. Neighbors on Prospect Street noticed what was happening at the Kessler house, the way neighbors in tight-knit neighborhoods tended to during that era, and help arrived in small, practical forms that Wanda accepted with considerably less pride-driven hesitation than she might have under different circumstances. Mrs. Pulaski, 2 doors down, sent over a jar of preserves one afternoon, simply left on the porch without much explanation needed. Another neighbor, a widow herself from years earlier, quietly mentioned which grocer in town was most willing to extend a few days' credit to a family going through exactly what the Kesslers were going through, information that mattered considerably more than the preserves ever could have on their own. That grocer, a man named Mr. Bianchi, who had run the same corner store on Kishwaukee Street for nearly 2 decades, had seen enough hardship pass through his aisles over the years to recognize exactly what Wanda's careful, deliberate shopping meant without her ever needing to explain a single word of it. He never offered charity outright, understanding correctly that Wanda would likely have refused it if he had, but he began quietly setting aside the less presentable produce, bruised apples, slightly wilted greens, still perfectly good for cooking, and selling it to her at a reduced price that never felt like pity, only practicality. Wanda has said she never forgot that particular kindness, the way it let her stretch her remaining money without ever once feeling like she was accepting something she hadn't earned. By the second week, with the insurance paperwork still slowly working its way through whatever process governed such things in 1956, Wanda had refined her $10 approach into something considerably more sustainable than her first improvised attempt. She began planning an entire week's meals before a single grocery trip, rather than deciding day by day. A shift that let her buy exactly what each planned meal actually required, rather than guessing and inevitably overbuying certain items while running short on others. She discovered that a single chicken, purchased whole rather than in pre-cut pieces, cost considerably less per pound and could be stretched across an entire week if handled carefully. Roasted first for Sunday dinner, the remaining meat picked clean and used for sandwiches or a simple casserole across the following days, and finally, the bones themselves simmered into a broth that formed the base for one last meal before the week's grocery cycle started over again. This single insight, that a whole animal purchased once could outperform the same money spent on smaller portions bought repeatedly throughout the week, became one of the most valuable lessons Wanda carried forward long after that first devastating month had finally passed. She applied that same logic to nearly everything else she bought from that point forward, choosing a whole cabbage over pre-shredded portions, a full block of cheese over individually wrapped slices, a large sack of oats over small single-serving boxes that charged considerably more per ounce for the convenience of not having to measure anything out yourself. Wanda began to see her weekly $10 less as a fixed sum and more as a kind of raw material, capable of producing considerably more food when purchased whole and unprocessed than the exact same amount could ever produce when spent on anything pre-portioned or pre-prepared. This shift in thinking, more than any single item on her original list, became the foundation for how she fed her family for years to come. The insurance settlement eventually arrived, roughly 5 weeks after the accident, considerably later than Wanda had hoped, but not so late that the intervening weeks hadn't mattered enormously to how she approached money for the rest of her life. It wasn't a large sum, nowhere close to what Gerald would have earned across the years he should have had left to work, but it provided enough breathing room that Wanda could finally stop recalculating flour sacks by lamplight every single evening, at least for the time being. But something had shifted permanently in how Wanda approached feeding her family, a shift that outlasted the immediate crisis by decades. She continued planning entire weeks of meals in advance, long after the insurance money had eased the initial pressure, continued buying whole chickens rather than convenient pre-cut portions, continued treating flour, beans, and eggs as foundations to be combined, rather than single-purpose ingredients meant for one dish alone. Her children grew up eating meals that stretched considerably further than their friends' families' meals typically did, not because the Kesslers remained desperately poor for the rest of their lives, but because Wanda had learned, in the hardest possible way, exactly how much value could be found in ingredients most families overlooked entirely. Ruthie, the daughter who had quietly helped manage her younger siblings during that first impossible week, later said that watching her mother stretch $10 across those early days taught her something about resourcefulness that no amount of comfortable living ever managed to erase afterward. She kept her own version of her mother's approach for the rest of her life, teaching her own children, decades later, the exact same trick with a whole chicken that her mother had discovered out of pure necessity in the cold weeks following February of 1956. Wanda Kessler raised all 4 of her children successfully on Prospect Street, remarrying briefly years later before that marriage too ended, and returning through it all to the same fundamental approach to feeding a family that she'd first written out on a notepad the night Gerald didn't come home. Foundations over variety, whole ingredients over convenient portions, a plan flexible enough to bend without breaking the moment reality turned out slightly different than expected. Carol, the baby who had been barely 2 years old during those first difficult weeks, grew up with no memory of her father at all, and no memory of the crisis her mother had quietly managed on her behalf. What she remembers instead, decades later, is a mother who never once seemed anxious in a grocery store, who could walk down any aisle and calculate almost instinctively exactly how far a particular item could be made to stretch across a week of meals for a family considerably larger than the two of them eventually became on their own. Carol never fully understood where that instinct had come from until she was well into adulthood herself, hearing the full story for the first time at her mother's own kitchen table, decades after the original one on Prospect Street had long since been sold along with the house it sat in. That original notepad list from February of 1956 didn't survive the decades the way some family keepsakes do, lost somewhere in one of several moves across the following years. But the habits it represented survived considerably longer than the paper itself ever could have, passed down through a family that never forgot exactly what $10 had once meant when it stood between 4 children and an uncertain week ahead. Wanda Kessler never described herself as a woman who had done anything extraordinary, insisting, whenever the story came up among family, that she had simply done what any mother would have done facing the exact same impossible math. $10, a notepad, and 4 children who needed feeding, regardless of what had happened that terrible February afternoon. What she built from those $10 wasn't just a week of meals. It was proof, repeated across decades afterward, that a careful plan built from almost nothing could still carry a family considerably further than anyone might reasonably expect. If Wanda's grocery list taught you something worth remembering, subscribe now, because we bring a true story of quiet resilience like this one every single week. Tell us in the comments what's one meal-stretching trick your own mother or grandmother swore by, and we'll feature the best answers in a future video.